The avoidant person is activated, attracted, and drawn in, not by your expressions of desire or your pursuit or your obvious interest, but by your silence, by your absence, by your complete withdrawal of attention and energy, by the mystery and the unavailability and the challenge that silence creates. And understanding this counterintuitive psychological reality is essential for making sense of why they seem most interested when you're least available, why they pursue when you pull back, why they want you most when you want them least, why your silence creates more desire in them than your passion ever could. This is not romantic notion about playing hard to get or about games and manipulation. This is fundamental truth about avoidance psychology and about what activates their desire system versus what deactivates it, about what creates attraction in their defended structure versus what triggers their withdrawal and their shutdown. The avoidance desire system operates differently than desire systems of people with other attachment styles because their desire is fundamentally linked to safety, control, and the absence of vulnerability, rather than to connection, intimacy, and mutual expression of want. For the avoidant, desire is most safely experienced when the object of desire is distant, unavailable, non-demanding, mysterious. When desire exists in their internal world, without requiring external action, without creating vulnerability, without obligating them to show up or to reciprocate or to be emotionally available. Silence creates these conditions perfectly. When you're silent, when you've withdrawn, when you're not expressing interest or need or desire for them, they can want you safely because wanting you doesn't require them to do anything vulnerable, doesn't create expectation they must meet, doesn't trigger their intimacy anxiety or their fear of being consumed. But when you express desire, when you pursue, when you show them you want them, it triggers their deactivation system. Suddenly your desire creates pressure, creates expectation, creates vulnerability. What if they can't reciprocate? What if they disappoint you? What if meeting your desire requires more emotional availability than they can sustain? Creates threat of engulfment where your want could consume them or require them to give more than feels safe. The paradox is that the avoidant is most turned on when they're least required to act on that attraction. When the desire can exist purely internally, without the complications of actual relationship, actual intimacy, actual vulnerability, and silence, your complete withdrawal and unavailability creates exactly this condition where they can desire you intensely while being completely protected from having to act on or express that desire in vulnerable ways. Why silence activates their desire more than pursuit ever could. The avoidant person's desire is activated most powerfully by silence and unavailability, rather than by pursuit or overt expressions of interest, because silence creates specific psychological conditions that allow desire to exist safely within their defended structure. Understanding why silence activates while pursuit deactivates reveals the fundamental psychology of avoidant attraction and explains their confusing pattern of wanting what they cannot have while fleeing what pursues them. Silence activates their desire because it removes the pressure and expectation that pursuit creates, allowing them to experience want without the vulnerability of having to reciprocate or respond. When you pursue them, when you express desire, when you show interest, it creates immediate pressure in their system, pressure to reciprocate, to meet your desire with their own, to show up emotionally, to be vulnerable in ways that match your vulnerability. This pressure is threatening and triggers their deactivation. But when you're silent, when you've withdrawn completely, there's no pressure. They can feel whatever they feel about you without obligation to express it, to act on it, to reciprocate it. The desire exists in safe internal space where they control it completely, where it doesn't require them to be vulnerable or to risk anything. This safety allows desire to flourish because it's not accompanied by the threatening demands that pursuit creates. Silence activates their desire because it creates scarcity and unavailability that trigger their psychological response of wanting what they cannot have. The avoidance desire system is paradoxically activated by unavailability and scarcity rather than by availability and abundance. When you're pursuing them, when you're available and interested, they have you, or at least they have access to you, and this availability makes you less desirable to their system that devalues what's readily accessible. But when you're silent, when you've withdrawn completely, when you're unavailable and possibly moving on, scarcity is created. They cannot have you easily, or perhaps cannot have you at all. This scarcity triggers loss aversion and desire for what's rare or difficult to obtain. Suddenly, you're more valuable, more desirable, more wanted because you're scarce rather than abundant, because having you would be achievement rather than given. Silence activates their desire because it creates mystery and unknown that their mind fills with idealization and fantasy in ways that reality and presence never allow. When you're present and pursuing them, you're known quantity. They know how you feel. They know what you want. They see your flaws and your humanity. They experience the reality of relationship with all its complexity and difficulty. But when you're silent, when you've withdrawn, you become unknown. They don't know what you're thinking or feeling. They don't know if you miss them or hate them or have moved on. They don't know what your life is like now, or who you're with, or how you've changed. This mystery allows their mind to idealize you, to imagine perfected version of you and the relationship, to create fantasy where you're everything they want without the complications that reality brings. This idealized fantasy version is more attractive than real you ever could be, because fantasy doesn't require actual vulnerability or actual compromise or actual emotional availability. Silence activates their desire because it places them in pursuing position rather than pursued position, and the avoidant is comfortable with and activated by being the pursuer, but threatened by being the pursued. When you pursue them, when you express desire for them, you're in active role, and they're in passive, reactive role, where they must respond to your advance. This position is threatening because it requires them to either reciprocate, which creates vulnerability, or reject, which creates guilt and triggers their fear of being bad person. But when you're silent, when you've withdrawn, the positions reverse. Now they're the one who would have to pursue if they want connection. They're in active role. You're in passive role. This reversal is more comfortable for them because pursuing feels like choice and control, while being pursued feels like pressure and potential trap. The desire is activated when they're in position of choosing to move toward you, rather than in position of having to respond to you moving toward them. Silence activates their desire because it provides space where they can process their feelings without the overwhelm of your presence and your emotional availability, triggering their anxiety. When you're present and available and expressing desire, the avoidant experiences overwhelm. Your emotions, your needs, your presence, your want, all feel like too much input, too much stimulation, too much demand on their system. They cannot process their own feelings when they're managing yours, cannot feel their own desire when yours is so present and demanding response. But silence creates space. In your absence, with no input from you, with no emotional demands, they can feel their own feelings. They can experience their desire for you. They're missing you. They're wanting without it being complicated by your simultaneous presence and needs. This space allows authentic desire to emerge that presence suppresses through overwhelm. Silence activates their desire because it forces confrontation with loss and absence that makes them recognize what they had and what they're missing now that it's gone. When you were pursuing them, when you were present and available, they took you for granted. They focused on the discomfort your presence created, the pressure, the expectations, the intimacy, anxiety. They couldn't appreciate what you provided because they were too busy managing their discomfort. But silence means loss. You're gone. Your presence, your care, your understanding, your acceptance, all of it is absent now. This absence creates contrast that allows them to recognize what they had, to miss specific things you provided, to realize what they lost through their patterns. This recognition of loss creates desire to restore what's missing, desire that didn't exist when they had you and were taking you for granted. Silence activates their desire because it creates fear of permanent loss and fear of you moving on that triggers their abandonment wound and creates desperate want to prevent the loss. The avoidant developed their patterns to protect against abandonment by being the one who leaves first, by caring less, by maintaining control over distance. But your silence, especially if accompanied by evidence you're moving on, triggers the core abandonment wound their defenses are meant to protect against. You've left. You're the one who is gone. You might find someone else. You might be happy without them. This activation of abandonment fear creates intense desire to prevent the loss, to restore connection, to ensure they haven't been completely abandoned. The desire is activated by fear of loss rather than by attraction to presence, but it's experienced as intense want nonetheless. The psychological mechanism that makes your absence irresistible. The avoidant person finds your absence and silence irresistible through specific psychological mechanisms that create intense attraction to what's unavailable, while simultaneously creating repulsion toward what's available and pursuing. Understanding these mechanisms reveals why the pattern is so consistent and why changing your behavior from pursuit to silence creates such dramatic shift in their response. Your absence becomes irresistible through the mechanism of fantasy and idealization that fills the space where reality and presence previously existed. When you were present, the avoidant related to actual you with all your complexity, your flaws, your needs, your human limitations. But when you're absent, when you're silent and withdrawn, they no longer relate to actual you, but to idealized version they construct in your absence. This idealized you is perfection. All the qualities they loved without the complications they found difficult. All the connection they wanted without the intimacy anxiety it triggered. All the understanding you provided without the reciprocation it required. This fantasy version is irresistible because it's exactly what they want without any of what they fear. The absence is what allows this fantasy to exist. Presence would force confrontation with reality that would shatter the idealization, but absence allows idealization to flourish unchecked. Your absence becomes irresistible through the mechanism of loss aversion, where the pain of losing something looms larger than the pleasure of having it, making you more valuable, lost than you were when present. Psychological research shows that people feel losses approximately twice as intensely as equivalent gains. When you were present and pursuing, you were gain, or potential gain, pleasant but not urgent, nice but taken for granted. But when you're absent, when you're silent and withdrawn, you're loss. They've lost your presence, your care, your interest, your availability. This loss feels more intense than the presence felt pleasant. The pain of absence is sharper than the pleasure of presence was, making the desire to restore what's lost more intense than the desire to maintain what they had. Your absence is irresistible because loss hurts more than presence pleased, creating motivation that presence never created. Your absence becomes irresistible through the mechanism of ego threat, where your disinterest or indifference challenges their sense of themselves as desirable and wanted, creating need to restore their validation. When you were pursuing them, you validated their desirability. Your interest proved they were wanted, attractive, valuable. This validation was taken for granted. But when you're absent and silent, especially if you seem indifferent or clearly moved on, it creates ego threat. You don't want them anymore. You're not interested. You don't care. This challenges their self-image and creates need to restore the validation you previously provided. They become driven to make you want them again, not necessarily because they want relationship with you, but because they need to prove to themselves they're still desirable, still capable of attracting you, still powerful enough to regain your interest. The irresistibility of your absence is partly about needing to restore their damaged ego. Your absence becomes irresistible through the mechanism of curiosity and need for closure, where not knowing creates mental preoccupation that presence and clarity would resolve. When you were present and pursuing, the avoidant knew where they stood. You wanted them. You were interested. You were available. This clarity allowed them to relax about you mentally because there was no mystery to solve. But your absence and silence create mystery. Why did you leave? How do you feel about them? Are you angry or indifferent? Are you suffering or thriving? Have you moved on, or are you still attached? This not knowing creates obsessive mental activity as their brain attempts to solve the mystery, to understand what happened, to resolve the uncertainty. The preoccupation with solving the mystery makes you irresistible because you occupy their thoughts constantly, because they cannot achieve closure or resolution without information from you, because the uncertainty is psychologically activating in ways that certainty was not. Your absence becomes irresistible through the mechanism of freedom from obligation, where they can want you intensely, because wanting you doesn't obligate them to do anything about it. When you were pursuing them, your desire created obligation. They felt they should respond, should reciprocate, should meet your interest with theirs, should show up emotionally. This obligation felt like burden and triggered resistance. But your absence eliminates obligation. They can want you, can miss you, can desire you without any requirement to act on these feelings, to express them, to follow through on them. The desire is safe because it exists in pure form, without the complications of reciprocation or vulnerability or showing up. This freedom from obligation makes the desire feel irresistible because it's uncomplicated by the fears and the pressures that accompanied desire when you are available and interested. Your absence becomes irresistible through the mechanism of competitive instinct, where the possibility that someone else might have you creates urgency and desire that your exclusive availability to them never created. When you were pursuing only them, when your interest was focused solely on them, there was no competition. They had you to themselves, or at least they had exclusive access to your romantic interest. But your absence, especially if accompanied by any indication you might be dating or interested in others, creates competition. Someone else might have you. Someone else might be receiving your care and your understanding. Someone else might be experiencing the connection they took for granted. This competitive instinct activates desire to claim you, to prevent someone else from having you, to win the competition. The irresistibility is amplified by competitive drive that your exclusive focus on them never triggered. Your absence becomes irresistible through the mechanism of mourning, where grieving the loss creates intense longing and romanticization of what they had, That presence prevented them from recognizing. When you were present, the avoidant couldn't fully appreciate what they had, because appreciation requires some distance and perspective. But your absence forces mourning process, where they grieve what they lost. Mourning involves remembering, missing, longing for what's gone. This process creates intense desire for what they're. Mourning romanticizes the relationship and your qualities, amplifies the positive while minimizing the negative. The absence is irresistible because mourning creates idealized longing that presence and reality never could create, because grief amplifies desire in ways that satisfaction suppresses. How? Overt desire and pursuit trigger their deactivation instead. The avoidant person's system responds to overt desire and pursuit, not with reciprocal desire, but with deactivation, withdrawal, and often repulsion. And this response is automatic and protective, rather than consciously chosen rejection of you. Understanding how and why pursuit triggers deactivation, rather than attraction, reveals why pursuing the avoidant is counterproductive strategy and why silence is more effective. Overt desire and pursuit trigger deactivation because they create immediate pressure to reciprocate that the avoidant experiences as threatening demand rather than as flattering interest. When you express desire for them, when you pursue them, when you show obvious interest, their system doesn't interpret this as positive validation, but as demand that creates anxiety. I need to respond to this. I need to match this energy. I need to reciprocate this interest. The pressure to reciprocate feels like obligation that threatens their autonomy and triggers their resistance. Rather than feeling flattered or attracted, they feel pressured and cornered. The deactivation is defensive response to protect against the perceived demand, creating distance that relieves the pressure. Your desire triggers their withdrawal because the desire feels like demand their system must escape. Overt desire and pursuit trigger deactivation because they signal that connection and intimacy are imminent, activating the avoidance intimacy anxiety and their fear of losing themselves. When you pursue them, when you express desire, you're signaling that you want connection, want relationship, want intimacy. This signal activates the avoidance core fear that intimacy means engulfment, means losing their identity, means being consumed by another person's needs and presence. Your desire promises exactly what they most fear: closeness, merger, dependency, vulnerability. The deactivation is protective response that creates distance, preventing the feared intimacy from materializing. They're not withdrawing because they don't want you. They're withdrawing because your desire signals that having you means accepting the intimacy they're terrified of, and choosing distance over intimacy is automatic defensive response. Overt desire and pursuit trigger deactivation because they remove the mystery and the chase that the avoidant finds psychologically engaging, replacing it with certainty and availability that feel boring or suffocating. The avoidant is activated by pursuit, by challenge, by having to work for something. When you pursue them, when you make your desire obvious, you remove all mystery and challenge. They know you want them. They know you're available. There's nothing to figure out, nothing to pursue, nothing to achieve. This certainty and availability can feel boring to their system that's activated by challenge and mystery. Additionally, your availability can feel suffocating because it signals you'll always be there. You'll always want them. They cannot escape your interest. This feeling of being trapped by your constant availability triggers deactivation as escape mechanism. The pursuit that was meant to draw them closer pushes them away because it removes the elements their system finds engaging. Overt desire and pursuit trigger deactivation because they activate the avoidance fear of disappointing you or failing to meet your needs, creating anxiety that drives withdrawal. When you express desire for them, when you pursue them with obvious interest, the avoidant becomes anxious about their capacity to meet your needs and expectations. They know they struggle with emotional availability. They know they tend to withdraw. They know they cannot sustain the level of intimacy and presence that your desire seems to promise you want. This awareness creates fear. What if I disappoint them? What if I can't be what they need? What if they realize I'm incapable of giving what they want? This fear of inevitable failure and disappointment triggers deactivation as preemptive protection. Better to withdraw now than to engage and eventually fail. Better to push you away than to let you down. Better to avoid than to disappoint. Overt desire and pursuit trigger deactivation because they create vulnerability where the avoidant must choose to reciprocate or reject, and both options feel threatening to their defended system. When you pursue them clearly, when you express desire unambiguously, you force them into position of having to respond. They must either reciprocate your interest, which creates vulnerability and obligation, or reject you explicitly, which triggers guilt and makes them feel like bad person for not reciprocating. Both options are uncomfortable. Reciprocating requires vulnerability they fear. Rejecting creates guilt they want to avoid. The deactivation allows them to avoid both uncomfortable options by creating ambiguous withdrawal that's neither clear reciprocation nor explicit rejection. They can withdraw without having to directly reject you, protecting themselves from both the vulnerability of reciprocation and the guilt of rejection. Overt desire and pursuit trigger deactivation because they remind the avoidant of their parents or early attachment figures whose needs felt overwhelming and whose demands they learned to manage through withdrawal. The avoidance patterns formed in response to early experiences where parental needs or demands felt overwhelming, where they learned that withdrawing and becoming self-sufficient was safer than engaging with parents who might be intrusive, demanding, or inconsistent. When you pursue them, when you express desire and needs, it unconsciously triggers these early patterns. Your pursuit feels like the overwhelming parental need or demand they learn to escape through withdrawal. The deactivation is automatic response based on early learning that pursuing needy people are threatening and must be escaped. This is not conscious rejection of you, but unconscious activation of deeply ingrained defensive pattern. Overt desire and pursuit trigger deactivation because they give the avoidant power and control in the dynamic, and once they have power, they lose interest because the challenge is gone. When you pursue them, you place them in power position. They're the desired one, the one being chased, the one who decides whether to reciprocate. This power is comfortable but not engaging. Once they have power, once they know they've won your interest, the psychological engagement disappears. There's no challenge, no uncertainty, no achievement to pursue. The desire that might have existed when the dynamic was uncertain evaporates once your pursuit makes clear they have all the power. The deactivation occurs because the dynamic is no longer psychologically engaging once they're definitively in control position. What this reveals about their capacity and what it means for you. The avoidant person's pattern of being activated by silence and deactivated by pursuit reveals specific information about their capacity for relationship and has important implications for how you understand them and for what decisions you make about engaging with them. Understanding what this pattern means helps you protect yourself and make informed choices. This pattern reveals that the avoidant can only sustain desire when the object of desire is unavailable, proving they cannot handle the vulnerability and intimacy that actual relationship requires. The fact that they want you when you're absent, but withdraw when you're available, and expressing interest proves that their desire is fundamentally incompatible with actual relationship. Relationship requires sustained mutual desire that can coexist with presence, with vulnerability, with intimacy, but the avoidance desire can only exist in absence of these things. When you're available, when you want them back, when relationship is actually possible, their desire evaporates. This proves they cannot sustain the desire in context of actual partnership, that their attraction is to fantasy and unavailability rather than to real intimacy. This information should inform your decisions. Someone who can only want you when they can't have you is not capable of healthy relationship with you. This pattern reveals that the avoidant is more comfortable with longing and fantasy than with actual connection and presence, indicating their emotional development is stuck in an adolescent or immature state. Mature adult desire involves wanting someone and being able to act on that desire, being able to pursue relationship, being able to sustain interest in context of mutual availability. But the avoidance desire that exists only in unavailability is adolescent pattern, longing from distance, pining for what cannot be had, romanticizing the unavailable. This reveals they're emotionally stuck, that their relational capacity hasn't developed to adult level where desire motivates building actual relationship rather than just experiencing feelings from safe distance. This immaturity means they're not ready for adult partnership, regardless of how strongly they feel about you when you're unavailable. This pattern reveals that the avoidant needs control, more than they need connection, that their priority is maintaining power and safety, rather than building mutual relationship. The activation by silence and deactivation by pursuit proves that what matters most to them is maintaining control. Control over the distance, control over their vulnerability, control over the dynamic. When you're silent and absent, they maintain control because they could reach out but choose not to, because the relationship exists only in their mind where they control it completely. When you pursue, you threaten their control by introducing your needs and your desires that they'd have to accommodate. The pattern reveals that control is non-negotiable for them, more important than connection, and this priority means they cannot build mutual relationship where both people's needs matter and where control is shared rather than hoarded. This pattern reveals that the avoidant is using you for ego validation and emotional regulation rather than for genuine partnership, that their interest is self-serving rather than truly relational. When they're activated by your silence, when they want you specifically when you're unavailable and no longer interested, it reveals they want you for what you provide their ego and their emotional system, validation that they're desirable, relief from abandonment anxiety, fantasy object for their longing, rather than wanting you as whole person with whom to build partnership. True relational desire involves wanting to be with someone, to build life with them, to share experiences with them. But the avoidance desire that exists only in your unavailability is about what you provide for them internally, not about actual relationship with you. This self-serving quality reveals they're using you rather than truly wanting partnership with you. This pattern reveals that any relationship with them would require you to maintain distance and unavailability indefinitely, that closeness and mutual expression of desire would consistently trigger their withdrawal. Understanding the pattern allows you to extrapolate what relationship with them would look like. You'd have to maintain mystery, never be too available, never express too much desire, constantly manage their anxiety through distance and withdrawal. The moment you became too close, too available, too expressive of need or desire, they deactivate and withdraw. This means relationship would be constant dance of approach and withdrawal, never achieving stable mutual intimacy. Recognizing this helps you understand that relationship with them cannot provide what you actually need and deserve: consistent presence, mutual desire, stable intimacy, ability to express yourself fully. This pattern reveals they need intensive therapeutic work to address their attachment wounds before they're capable of healthy relationship, that their patterns are deeply ingrained and won't change without professional intervention. The automatic nature of their deactivation in response to pursuit and their activation in response to unavailability proves these are not conscious choices, but deeply ingrained defensive patterns formed in childhood. These patterns don't change through awareness alone or through wanting to be different. They require sustained therapeutic work to address the underlying attachment wounds, to develop distress tolerance, to learn to manage intimacy anxiety, to build capacity for vulnerability. Without this work, the patterns will persist regardless of how much they care about someone. This information helps you understand that their patterns are their responsibility to address, not your responsibility to manage or work around. This pattern ultimately means you should use silence not as strategy to get them back, but as boundary that protects you from engaging with someone whose desire system is fundamentally incompatible with healthy relationship. Silence works to activate their desire. This is true. You could use this information strategically to make them want you, to make them pursue you, to make them experience the desire they couldn't experience when you were available. But this would be using silence as manipulation rather than as boundary. The healthier application of this understanding is to use silence as protection from someone whose desire only exists when relationship is impossible, whose attraction to you is fundamentally based on your unavailability. Maintain silence, not to make them want you, but because you recognize that someone who can only want you when you're unavailable cannot give you what you need, cannot build healthy relationship with you, cannot provide the mutual sustainable partnership you deserve. The silence should be permanent boundary rather than temporary strategy, protecting you from someone whose desire system reveals they're incapable of healthy reciprocal love.